Death at Gallows Green. Chapter 24. Englishmen are strange creatures. I doubt if they ever really fall in love. They marry, of course, but generally from a prudent motive. Maud Depoy to her mother, 1883. Charles opened the door of Bradford Marston's study. His friend was standing by the French doors, looking out, hands thrust into his pockets. "May I intrude?" he asked. Bradford turned from the window. "Ah, Charlie," he said heartily. "Sit down and solve a problem for me, will you?" Charles sat down by the fire and put both feet on the fender. "I came to ask you to solve one for me." He pulled out his pipe. "But let's hear yours first. What is it?" "What else?" Bradford went to the sideboard and poured 2 glasses of brandy. "Money." Charles wasn't surprised. Lord Marston had settled an allowance on his eldest son, but it almost never went far enough to support Bradford's expensive tastes. From time to time his friend had applied to him for the funds he needed to get out of a tight place, and Charles had always been glad to oblige. Without exception, the money had been repaid. "How can I help?" Charles asked. He took the brandy snifter from Bradford and placed it on the inlaid table at his elbow. Bradford sat down in a leather chair and put his booted feet up on a grosse-point ottoman. "Lend me £5,000, interest at the current rate, of course." Charles raised both eyebrows. It was the largest loan his friend had asked of him yet. As a younger son, Charles had long ago accepted the fact that his older brother Robert would inherit the bulk of the Sheridan estate and money, as he had upon the death of Charles' father several years before. But Charles was not without fortune, for his father had settled a house and an allowance on him, and he had received a sizable legacy from his maternal grandmother. His public status as a second son functioned to keep him single, while his private fortune set him at liberty to enjoy his bachelor existence as an amateur scientist, amateur photographer, and amateur criminologist. Still, he had to live on his income, and £5,000 was quite a lot of money. Bradford's face was grave. "I wouldn't ask you if you weren't the final resort," he said, "and this is the last request you'll have of me." He swung his feet to the floor and sat forward in the armchair, his eyes lightening. "I've decided to marry Charlie. The woman on whom I have settled my choice is well established. We should be able to do quite well on her income until I come into the baronetcy." Charles raised his glass. "I thought I'd never live to see the day. Good for you, Marston. Who is the lucky lady?" Bradford stood up. "She is Miss Ardley of Bishop's Keep." Charles stared, his thoughts turning around a hollow centre that had suddenly opened up inside of him. Bradford and Miss Ardley were to be married, but what about Ned and Miss Ardley? Had the woman been engaged in some sort of flirtatious game, playing the offer of one suitor against another? But even as Charles asked himself that question, he answered it. He did not know Kate Ardley well, and now was not likely to do so, but he knew at least that she was not capable of a duplicitous dealing in hearts. He had not seen Ned Lakin since yesterday morning. There had been plenty of time for her to honourably refuse one man and accept the other. She was perfectly within her rights to do so, and wise too, at least as the world would see it. Ned was a very good man, but Bradford was, or would be, a very rich one. "I see," he said. The hollowness within him seemed to echo in his voice, and he cleared his throat. "When will the wedding occur?" "As soon as is convenient. I may have taken my time to settle my choice, but now that I know my mind, I do not intend to linger. I plan to make the proposal in the next day or two." "I see," Charles said again. So she had not yet committed herself. "But you may expect the bargain to be struck most expeditiously," Bradford added. "I've called on the lady once or twice and found her gracious and willing. I know of no other suitors, and of course the match is logical and quite prudent since our properties adjoin." As if from a distance, Charles heard himself ask, "Do you love her?" "Love her?" Bradford sounded surprised, as he well might. It was not a question that one gentleman would ask another. "I don't know. Haven't given it any thought. I suppose I will, once we're married. People do, don't they? Now about the loan. Consider it done, Charles said. He covered his feelings by searching in his pockets for tobacco. I'll obtain a bank draft for the funds immediately. Bradford's sigh of relief was almost audible. Many thanks, old man. You can't think how you have eased my mind. He stood and went to the window, looking out on the preparations for the garden party that was to take place on the manor grounds that afternoon. And Mamma's, although she does not know it yet. I'll need the money tomorrow, if possible, so I can retrieve her bloody emeralds from Attenborough's greedy clutches. Emeralds? Charles asked. He paused in mid-gesture, his tobacco pouch in his hand. You took Lady Marston's emeralds. Of course, Bradford said. Did you think Mamma would carry out such an errand herself? He turned frowning. What do you know of the emeralds, Charlie? Well, Bradford's face darkened. You have no need to answer. It was my sister, wasn't it? She told you they were gone. His chuckle was sour. No sense at all, women. She came to me last night claiming they had been stolen. Charles finished filling his pipe before he spoke. It was not Eleanor who spoke to me about the matter, he said. It was Miss Ardley. Eleanor confided to her a fear that Laurent might have made off with them. Miss Ardley! Bradford pulled at his moustache, scowling. Confound that Eleanor, he muttered. Can't keep her mouth shut. Probably carried the tale to that husband of hers, too. Suppose I'll have to set her right. That would relieve her of the concern that Lawrence took the jewels, Charles said. Bradford swallowed the last of his brandy and set the glass on the sideboard, turning to face Charles. Well then, you have solved my problem, and handily at that. Now let me have a shot at yours. What is it? Charles lit his pipe and pulled on it, giving himself a moment to flush Kate Ardley out of his mind and call up the matter that had brought him to Bradford's study in the first place. What do you know of poaching? He asked. Poaching? Bradford poured himself another brandy. In general, you mean, or hereabouts? He held up the decanter. Another brandy. Charles shook his head. Hereabouts, he said. And tell me about your assistant gamekeeper, MacGregor. Have you had him long? MacGregor has been in service for a decade or so, Bradford said. My grandfather set sport above all else. When he died, a dozen liveried gamekeepers headed his funeral procession. Bradford chortled dryly. They're nearly gone, though. MacGregor and Peters, the chief keeper, are remnants. Papa's passion for horses supersedes every other. He has no time for anything that does not involve a horse. But he does insist on a minimum of preservation, maintaining the game coverts and the deer in the park, and holding down the poaching wherever possible. He glanced at Charles. What is this about, if I may ask? It has to do with Sergeant Oliver's death. If the emeralds were not a possible motive, as Miss Ardley had suggested, the only thing left that resembled a clue was the connection to the poaching. Yes, sad business that. Are the police making any progress? Precious little. The constable from Manningtree received an anonymous tip, and when he went to investigate, he found a pair of hairs and a net in Oliver's shed. Artie wasn't the sort to be involved in anything dishonest, but it looks very bad. The police committee could very well deny his widow's pension. If so, it would go hard with her. In grandfather's day, possession of a net alone would have sent the man to Australia for 7 years, policeman or not, Bradford remarked. He frowned as he took a cigar from a gold case on the table beside him. Is there a suggestion that MacGregor is involved in the murder? Charles drew on his pipe. No evidence, only suspicion at the moment. He did not want to say whose suspicion it was. The man is a shifty devil, Bradford said, sniffing the cigar appreciatively. I don't recall the details, but there was some trouble years back when he beat one of the tenants for cutting down a game shelter. When Papa learned of it, he stopped the practice of planting shelters in the middle of the fields. He applied a match to the cigar and pulled on it. One has to think of the tenant's livelihood. It is to the detriment of the crops when the land becomes nesting and feeding grounds for game. His smile was rueful. My grandfather would have had me canned for such heresy, of course. MacGregor has a brother-in-law, Tommy Brock. What can you tell me about him? Only that he's a neighborhood nuisance. He was accused of stealing several sacks of thrashed grain some while back, but there wasn't enough evidence to have him up, so the matter was let drop. Charles hoisted himself to his feet. You will keep your ear to the ground and let me know if you hear anything about either MacGregor or Brock. I will, Bradford said. He stood too and held out his hand. "My dear Charles, many thanks for the loan. You have saved me from a rather nasty circumstance." "You're quite welcome." If Lady Marston's emeralds were at stake, Charles did not doubt that the circumstance was indeed nasty. He had known for some time about Bradford's financial interest in Harry Lander's various motorcar schemes. It wouldn't surprise him if the recent failure of the Paramount horseless carriage stock figured prominently in his friend's need for money, and if that need figured equally prominently in Bradford's decision to marry. Not that Miss Ardley herself were not attraction enough, he reminded himself with great sadness. "Well, things may be a bit rocky just now, but all will be well once Miss Ardley and I are wed." Bradford clapped Charles on the shoulder. "Will you be the chief groomsman, Charlie? I can think of no friend that would better like to stand beside me on such a great occasion." Charles met his friend's eyes with as much candor as he could summon. "I would be honored." "I knew I could count on you, old man," Bradford said. "Knowing the esteem in which you are held by Miss Ardley, I'm sure that she will agree to your place in our wedding party." "Thank you for the compliment," Charles said, and escaped.